Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to class 32. Today we're going to be talking about religious perspectives on climate justice, looking at both the Islamic Declaration on climate change as well as excerpts from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common world. And we're going to be thinking about how these conceptions of climate justice both contribute to the way that we've been thinking about climate justice throughout this course, but also provide different ways of framing similar questions that we've already discussed. And so we're going to look at these arguments and as well as thinking about the different value claims that are underlying them. So to start our conversation, we can return to our recurring friend, Dale Jameson here. And if we recall the kind of general argument that he makes throughout the various pieces that we've read from him, is that there's a particular form of thinking that focuses on individual responsibility, cost-benefit analysis, viewing nature as a resource. This in his he describes this in various places as like economic thinking or administrative thinking, but that all of these contribute to the displacement of responsibility for climate change and the environmental crisis. His quote from the first piece of his that we read from 1992, that we face the real possibility that the global environment might be destroyed and no one will be responsible. And so both within that piece and in the more recent piece that we read on virtue ethics, again, we have this idea that we need to change the way that the value systems at work in our discussions around justice, that we need a different way of thinking about environmental values and thinking about justice and responsibility, and from the kind of ways that we think about these in terms of legal responsibility, economic cost-benefit analysis, and traditional politics. And so, kind of inspired by that, we're going to look at two different ways in which religious groups have tried to articulate a different way of valuing climate change, a different way of valuing humanity's relationship to the environment. Now, I'm going to post two videos up on Moodle that are kind of descriptive of both the Islamic Climate Change Symposium, from which the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change was kind of came out of that, as well as the Pope Francis's appeal on climate change, his encyclical on climate change, just to give you a little bit more of a sense of the background and kind of scope of these calls, and I'll put these on Moodle for you to watch. But let's look at the actual texts of both this declaration and of the encyclical, and they both begin with this shared premise that modernity is unsustainable. The modernity, this kind of the form of life and political and social organization and economic organization that we've inherited from the Enlightenment is characterized by secularism, by liberal democracy, by market capitalism. It's as an entire value system is not sustainable in its current form, that we need to revive a different conception of nature that is not dead, that is not separate from humanity, that is not a resource to be used efficiently or prudently, but that something that we are ultimately interrelated with and mutually dependent upon. So, for example, the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change says, in reference to the kind of scientific evidence on global warming, that we are driven to conclude from these warnings that there are serious flaws in the ways that we have used natural resources, the sources of life on Earth, and an urgent and radical reappraisal is called for. They continue, yet it would also be mistaken to view other living beings as mere objects subjected to arbitrary human domination. When nature is viewed solely as a source of profit and gain, this has serious consequences for society. That's from the Pope Francis' encyclical, and he also writes in another section, in the present condition of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable. And so you can already see that there's both of these texts begin and articulate a very forceful call for a fundamental new way of thinking about our relationship with nature, and this means linking this question of our relationship with the environment with questions of justice, that these are linked together, and these cannot be dealt with separately, and they can only be dealt with through a much more fundamental reevaluation of our relationship to society and the way that or to the environment and the way that we have organized our societies. And so they argue for a few different reappraisals. And the first is changing the way that we think about nature from this disenchanted view of nature, which we have which is kind of projected by modern science as something external to us, as having no intrinsic purpose and no source of intrinsic value. This leads us to thinking about nature as dead matter that can be exploited for human value. But instead, both the Declaration and the encyclical argue for thinking about nature as created by God and not by human beings, and that therefore it is endowed by value with God. So the Islamic Declaration reads, "We affirm that Allah is Lord and sustainer of all beings. He is the one creator. Nothing that he creates is without value. Each thing he has created in truth and for right." That there is an intrinsic value to all of creation, kind of moving from the environment or nature to this idea of creation, that everything is created with a purpose, everything is created with some meaning and value. And as Francis writes, nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, and as reality illuminated by the love which calls us together in universal communion. So there's a different way of thinking about how we consider the non-human world, how we consider the environment. Do we view this as simply something that can be studied and mastered and controlled, or are we thinking about the environment as having intrinsic moral properties? Similarly, both texts emphasize that nature not only has a divine value, an instituted value, but that it's organized in such a way that all the parts work together in harmony. The natural balances and cycles are sufficient to provide for human needs, and all parts of creation are united together as an expression of God's will. And this doesn't mean that there are no differences between rocks, trees, elephants, and humans, but despite and because of these differences, all living creatures reflect this pre-established harmony of existence. And so the Declaration writes that God created the earth in perfect equilibrium. By his immense mercy, we have given fertile land, fresh air, clean water, and all good things on earth. The earth functions in natural seasonal rhythms and cycles. That there's a natural organization and meaning and structure to the natural world, and that natural world is good and provides human beings with what they need. Similarly, all of us, Francis writes, are linked as by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. That we are not separate from nature in this conception, but that we are all part of creation, and that should fill us with a kind of religious awe or reverence to the rest of creation in the same type of dignity that we have for other human beings. And so that this changes the way that we shouldn't think of nature as a bunch of separate organisms and separate entities, but as all of nature, including human beings and including society, are integrated within this pre-established whole. This means that we have to be responsible stewards of creation, that this part of what makes humanity distinctive, being endowed with reason and intelligence, is a special responsibility to be stewards of creation. That creation is intended to provide us what we need, but we have to care for it and preserve it, not use it and abuse it. We have to ensure that the natural order and balance are maintained while caring for our own needs and the needs of others. So the Declaration writes, we recognize that we are but a minuscule part of the divine order, yet within that order we are exceptionally powerful beings, and we have the responsibility to establish good and avert evil in every way we can. Intelligence and conscience should lead us, as our faith commands, to treat all things with care and awe of their Creator, compassion and utmost good. You can see that this language kind of both elevates and humbles humanity, right? That we are not fully in charge of all the things that happen in the world, but we also have a unique and exceptional amount of power that entails a certain degree of responsibility. Or, as Francis writes, this responsibility for God's earth means that human beings endowed with intelligence must respect the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between the creatures of this world. That the laws of nature and these natural harmony, natural balance in nature should be respected. And that means that we need to kind of work to maintain and care for this natural balance in nature. Fourth is the fourth way that they reframe the question of climate change is bringing in this idea of corruption and sin. That this is despite this obligation to be good stewards and respect the balance of the natural order, both texts argue that the root of the climate crisis is in human activity that has exceeded its divinely preordained world. That it's not just that climate change isn't just a question of inefficiencies or unsustainable use of resources, but there's a much stronger connotation as that what we've done is violated God's directive, that we've corrupted our nature, that we've engaged in sinful behavior. And for both Francis and the Declaration, this corruption or disregard of our connections to other human beings and to the non-human world risks putting all life in jeopardy, destroying the beautiful creation that is an expression of God's love and will. So the Declaration reads, "Our species has been the cause of such corruption and devastation, and that we are in danger of ending life as we know it on this planet." This language of corruption is very different than this language of pollution. Similar to pollution, but it's the idea that that we have corrupted this in some way, that we are making what God has created worse, that we are perverting it from its purpose. They also write, "This corruption that humans have caused on Earth in our relentless pursuit of economic growth and consumptions." Again, linking it to broader questions of political economy, linking it to the questions of the types of value systems and the way that we've organized our political, social, and economic relationships. Or as Francis's encyclical writes, "Today, where sin is manifest in all its destructive power and wars, the various forms of violence and abuse, the abandonment of the most vulnerable, the attacks on nature," right? That these are all linked for Francis, and similarly for the Declaration, that war, abuse, and exploitation, the abandonment of the poor and the most vulnerable, the destruction of nature, are all linked together. That these are all part of a flawed value system that needs to be corrected. "When these relationships are neglected," he continues, "when justice no longer dwells in the land, the Bible tells us that life itself is in danger." So here the same language that we saw in the Declaration, that this corruption threatens all life on Earth, that this is not simply a inconvenience, and it's not simply going to affect the natural world, but this is actually something that will risk the human project as a whole. Finally, they argue for a holistic or integrated, Francis writes of an integral ecology, that we need to approach these questions holistically, that we need to consider nature and what we consider society are interconnected and interrelated, and they're both manifestations of God. This requires not tackling any one crisis or symptom, but an entire way of thinking that creates these interrelated environmental and social crises. It's not enough to solve poverty if we do so by destroying the natural world, and it's not enough to limit climate change if it intensifies inequality and increases burdens on the poor. So this means that requires a concerted action by whole communities to really change the way that they've organized their social lives, the way that they've organized their worlds. As the Declaration writes, "We call on all Muslims, wherever they may be, to tackle the habits, mindsets, and the root causes of climate change, environmental degradation, and the loss of biodiversity, and to bring about a resolution to the challenges that now face us." This is very similar to Jameson's discussion in his piece on virtue ethics, that we need to kind of focus on these dispositions and mindsets and emotions and characters and character. Or as Francis writes in the encyclical, "We are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature." This kind of we need to kind of address both of these, and we need to address the root causes at both of these challenges. So how should we interpret these religious arguments? What should we make of these arguments being raised here? Well, on the one hand, these are calling for a fundamental reorientation of thinking, that both the Declaration and the encyclical are not arguing for a better price on carbon or a better way to manage pollution, but they're arguing that unless we tackle the flawed ways of valuing each other and valuing nature, we're going to just keep recreating these environmental and social crises. That instead we need a holistic account of climate justice that is addressing both exploitation and domination and oppression and the destruction of nature. And that this is bound up with a critique of modernity, that our response to climate change can't come from the modern ways of thinking from modern science and economics and politics, that we need a fundamental new way of dwelling with each other and on the earth, that this is a different form of thinking that is going to that requires reforming the way that we've organized our lives. And so this presents a real challenge. That is this type of argument accessible in a modern and secular context? Can these arguments either rhetorically be persuasive, or is this way of thinking even possible? Is it possible to kind of go back to a pre-modern or an anti-modern way of thinking, or are certain assumptions about cost-benefit about analysis, about individual rights and liberties, about liberal market democracies, are these assumptions so well entrenched in our modern societies that it's impossible to actually have this fundamentally reorganization of the way that we relate to other human beings and to nature? Alternatively, we could view these arguments more for their rhetorical appeal, as ways to appeal to a broader coalition that might not traditionally be considered environmentalists, to appeal to climate justice. That framing climate justice in these religious remarks might work to expand a coalition of climate justice. And so we can think about some of the concepts that we were talking about last class. This might be a form of bridging rhetoric, especially of kind of bridging to potentially more religiously conservative conservatives who might not prioritize climate justice but try to expand the bridge by speaking in the language that might be more palatable. It also might be a form of bonding rhetoric, of trying to appeal to the in-group, right? That they are appealing to, they are using the language of Christianity and Islam respectively, and they are trying to appeal to those groups and to galvanize those groups. And so the question for this is, well, how useful is this religious framing as a rhetorical appeal? There's some studies that suggest a positive framing, but then other studies, including some work done by sociologists McWright and Dunlap, that argue that the religious framing is no more successful than the economic framing or a national security framing. That climate change itself has become this master framing device. People who are climate skeptics, no matter how you frame it, are unlikely to be moved by any of these rhetorical appeals. And there's also the danger of how effective this is as bridging rhetoric. Is this type of argument going to appeal to secular or more economically focused actors? Is this going to appeal beyond devout religious communities? So next class, we're going to continue looking at these alternative perspectives by looking explicitly at indigenous perspectives. There's two pieces, and both of these focus on different ways of conceiving time and the question of environmental and climate justice. So how do indigenous thought, practice, and experience reframe the question of climate change? And for your discussion thread for this evening, I'd like you to compare and contrast either the Islamic Declaration or the Pope's encyclical with the ways that political philosophers have discussed and framed climate justice. You don't have to discuss the entire class, but maybe pick one or two important points of comparison and contrast. What benefits do these religious framings have? What drawbacks do these religious framings have? And how can they contribute to our study and in activism around climate justice? So that's going to be it for this afternoon. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email, stop by in office hours, join the discussion sections. And we are almost at the end of this semester, but again, if you're having trouble completing any of the assignments, please let me know and we will work together to find appropriate accommodations. That's it for now. Keep washing your hands, stay inside, stay safe, and take care. I'll see you next class.